Hello, everybody. Welcome to A British Audiophile and my second podcast. And today I have Ian White, who is editor and chief of Ecoustics. Ian, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what you do there?
Oh, good evening, Taryn, and thank you for doing this tonight.
Nice to have you here.
I know it's late in the UK, and it's only in the middle of the afternoon here in New Jersey. So my role with Ecoustics is that I am the editor in chief. I'm responsible for the day-to-day operation of the magazine in terms of both my own writing, Brian's writing, and the editing of all of our other journalists and writers and reviewers that are in North America and some that are overseas. And I guess I come to this after 23 years of being a journalist and editor in the consumer audio video space. Started with Soundstage back in 1998. And I've written for Enjoy the Music, Digital Trends for a long time, Gear Patrol. And also Big Picture, Big Sound. I have to give a shout out to my mate, Chris Boylan. And Brian and I actually met a little over a year and a half ago during COVID's sort of high point here in North America. And, the two of us discussed a bunch of things, how he wanted to change Ecoustics and, how I envisioned the magazine going forward. And we've managed to make enormous strides, during the pandemic. I think, the results speak for themselves if you look at the website.
Yeah. Great. Well, wonderful. So I should have started with saying wonderful to have you here as a guest.
Same here.
Great. In what do you do for Ecoustics anyway? But thank you for coming on. We've spoken once before on, me, you and Brian before. So it's just nice to have you here. I appreciate you coming on. And I suppose last time when me and Brian were on, I was doing most of the talking, but this time I think I'll let you do most of the talking. And I just want to ask you how you got started.
So my journey is definitely a little unconventional. I would say I'm sure there's audiophiles who have a similar story in terms of their history. I became an audiophile even before I even knew what that phrase meant when I was a kid. I was very fortunate growing up in Canada. I had parents who were actually more cinephiles than they were music listeners. So I was one of those kids who in 1977 saw Star Wars on opening day in Toronto. And that was an experience that totally messed with my head for the rest of my life. All you have to do is look behind me. That doesn't even represent 1/20th of my Star Wars. Yeah. Oh yeah. I have hundreds of pieces that I've collected over the last 44 years, Star Wars sort of memorabilia from around the globe. And that turned me into a movie nut. So I really never envisioned myself ever writing about hi-fi. My family's background was actually in the food service industry. We were in the pizza business. And so I sort of learned how to cook at a young age, and I always wanted to be a journalist. How I became a journalist is that I had a very severe speech impediment when I was a kid, and I hated speaking because I would open my mouth in Hebrew school and I would get pounded on the playground. Now, of course, I'm 6'3", 220 pounds, built like an NHL goaltender. No one pounds me on the playground, but I was afraid to open my mouth in class. So I kind of, I guess, disappeared in my writing, and I disappeared sort of in movies and music. My mom was a prosecutor. My dad was a businessman and a professor. And movies were like the most important family activity growing up. And I was very fortunate because Toronto in the 70s and the early 80s had some of the best Art Deco style movie theaters in North America. So I spent most of my childhood literally sitting in front of some of the first THX certified sort of theaters in North America, the Eglinton Theater, which is people from Toronto will know it. But I grew up at 5 or 6 of the best movie theaters really in the world, probably. And when I saw Star Wars in 1977 as a 7-year-old, my head practically exploded. And I remember walking out of the theater thinking to myself, I don't care. I mean, even though there's a hockey stick behind me and I've played hockey for 4+ decades, I wasn't, I guess, your typical Canadian kid who was obsessed with playing hockey all the time. I would skip school at a very young age and go to movie theaters. And that became a little more interesting after my bar mitzvah at 13, because I had a massive growth spurt. I went from 4'9" to 6'3" in a span of a year and a half.
Wow.
And and then I started to grow my Theodore Kaczynski beard in high school. So I would go to theaters during the day, and they would say, "Are you 18?" Because back then they actually checked ID to see if you were actually an adult. And I would sneak into R-rated films when I was 14, 15, 16. And so that sort of cemented my obsession with movies.
Yeah.
You know, and
that Star Wars, that was that one of the first movies where they really went all out with the sound side of it, or was that?
Well, Star Wars. I mean, I would give that credit more to 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think
Okay.
Stanley Kubrick was actually way ahead of his. Well, George Lucas borrowed is a loose way of putting it. George Lucas borrowed a lot of items, a lot of styles from Akira Kurosawa. If you watch any of the Kurosawa samurai films, Hidden Fortress, Throne of Blood, Rashomon, Yojimbo, the Jedi are basically based off of the Japanese samurai Ronin, and also George Lucas stole a lot from John Ford, who made all the classic Hollywood Western films way before George Lucas was even born. So I became obsessed with cinema, and then pretty much pivoted from Star Wars to every other genre. And I think the way I got into sound and became an audiophile was that there's a very famous hi-fi shop in Toronto called Babler Radio. And the gentleman who opened it was a man by the name of Saul Mendelson. He passed away many years ago, just a lovely guy. He was essentially the guy who created high-end audio retail in Canada. It did not exist without him.
And when was this?
So I went to his store for the first time when I was 8 or 9. So this would have been in the late 1970s.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm aging myself. Anyone here who's bad at math, I'm 51. So basically, I had never. My parents had a fairly decent stereo when I was a kid. Like my dad made sure we had like the big TV. We purchased our first VCR in 1979. So I was already into home video in 1979 when very few people had a big JVC VidStar. And I remember listening. I remember the first time I went to the store and I listened to a pair of Bowers and Wilkins speakers, and there was he was the first Macintosh dealer in Toronto, and he had Marantz and Lynn and sort of all the brands that were really big on the high end side in the 70s and early 80s. And I was just shocked by the difference. Like, I mean, because when I think about what my parents had at home, and here I was in front of these massive Bowers and Wilkins speakers with hundreds and hundreds of watts of Macintosh power, I didn't really know what to think. But also I think my parents had very limited taste in music. And I think a part of that came from the front, because I come from a Holocaust family, because my grandparents were survivors of Auschwitz, and they were liberated from Bergen-Belsen, and most of my family perished in the Holocaust, unfortunately. So my grandparents, who I grew up with, their first language was Yiddish. So I listened to a lot of Yiddish music, a lot of klezmer as a kid growing up. And my kids sort of laughed today when I put on klezmer, because they're like looking at me like, this is not Billie Eilish, like what the hell are you listening to? So I grew up with that, and I grew up with Leonard Bernstein, and I grew up with Aaron Copland. And my parents weren't exactly hippies. Like, I had the two square parents, unfortunately.
Was it quite a Jewish family that you grew up in then, essentially?
Yeah, I grew up like in a typical survivor family. My mom was born in a DP camp in Germany after the war, and both my parents were very highly educated people. With my mom was a prosecutor. I mean, she was probably one of the first of her kind in the early 1970s in Canada, and so my parents put a lot of value in art and the arts. I mean, we always went to movies. They would take us to outdoor concerts because we were too obnoxious to be actually inside with people. They didn't want, because I'm the eldest of 5, and I don't think they could handle all five of us in a concert hall, making noise and touching things. But I started to appreciate music on a serious level when I was about 8, 9, 10. I think that's when it really sort of it stuck with me. And for my bar mitzvah in 1983. Most Jewish kids, when they have their bar mitzvah, either they just want a lot of checks from relatives, or they want something cool like a pinball machine, or because if you think about it, in the 1980s, like everyone wanted like a Pac-Man machine or something like crazy like that.
Yeah.
No, not me. I basically said to my dad, "Can I have the family stereo?"
Right.
And my mother sort of looked at my dad like, "Okay, it's safer than guns or drugs, so I guess we're doing okay." And my dad used that as an excuse to upgrade what he had. So all of a sudden, he had an excuse to go back to Babler Radio and buy a Macintosh system, which drove my mom crazy because it was ridiculously expensive even back then.
Yeah.
So my first hi-fi stereo in 1983, it was a pair of British Celestion Ditton 33 Mark II speakers.
Okay.
I had, it was which were very, very good speakers for
Yeah.
a 13-year-old in 1983.
Celestion made some really good speakers back then.
I had Sansui FM tuner, a Yamaha CA 2010 receiver. It was actually, it was an integrated amplifier. I think it was a receiver too. And then I had a Thorns turntable, and
Nice.
CD didn't really exist yet. So I effectively had. Oh, also my father, in a moment of insanity, actually gave me a Nakamichi entry-level tape deck from the system because he didn't think anyone listened to tapes anymore. So here I was, 13.
Tape deck back then, they were very well regarded.
Yeah. So here I was. Oh yeah. Here I was, a 13-year-old kid with a stereo that was better than most people probably still have today. And then my house was in a very weird spot. We were atop of a hill in a downtown neighborhood, and I had perfect line of sight with the CN Tower. And the CN Tower is the tallest antenna really in North America. So I hung an FM antenna out of my bedroom window. My parents let me live on the top floor of the house. And that way, I think that's because they didn't want to hear my music. So it was like, go upstairs and whatever, we don't care. And I started to listen to classical and jazz music stations almost nightly. It was sort of like I didn't really know much about classical music or jazz. In fact, I don't think my parents owned any jazz music. So I found the one station in Toronto that existed back then, which would have been, I guess, CJRT. And there was a very famous American jazz radio announcer by the name of Bob Parlocha. And he died many years ago. But he was sort of one of these guys that had a larger than life sort of persona, and he had a tremendous voice. Like you would hear him and you knew exactly who it was. And I remember one night I tuned to his program, which was syndicated out of the US, because I generally picked up Buffalo, New York radio, Rochester, New York radio. If I was lucky, maybe something from Ohio. But that required, like a freak of nature. There was some kind of, whatever to Ohio from Toronto. And he played a Stanley Turrentine song. And I remember just sort of sitting up in my bed and thinking, like, holy, what is this? And that started like a total obsession with jazz music that has continued now till I'm 51. And also my love of movies also created an obsession with movie soundtracks.
Right.
So like my wife laughs. My wife laughs that when I die, that they're gonna just bury me surrounded by all the movie soundtracks.
You've got a nice collection around you of all sorts of things. I can't quite make out what is it. Records in the background or not?
Yeah. There's that's like the overflow.
Okay.
It's an ugly topic in my home because I did not. So my wife loves music. So I'm fortunately married to somebody who was an 80s child, and she is an encyclopedia of 80s music. So in that regard, I lucked out. But our tastes in music are definitely very different aside from the 80s music. And but I think, I remember when we first met, I had a pair of massive horn speakers. And when we got married, we lived in northern New Jersey. I brought these massive horn speakers into our living room, and she gave me a look that basically said, "Yeah, this might not last."
Yeah, you're not getting. It's you or the You can take those speakers with you out the door.
Yeah, and, or how much are those worth if I kill you? And we hide. Also, I'm married to someone from Staten Island, New York, so people from New York will understand that comment. They might, she might have the speakers for life, but Ian's body might disappear at fresh kill. But it's just, I don't know. It's just in high school. In high school, I was really, really obsessed with hi-fi, and
Right.
and my friends would spend every penny they had on cigarettes and booze. You know, so it shows you what kind of healthy lifestyle we lived back in. But
It's
it was
much
like
better. Hi-fi is much healthier.
yeah, but I saved all my money for music and movies,
Yeah.
and it was and so the other thing that really impacted me, very famous music store in downtown Toronto called Sam the Record Man.
Okay.
And when HMV finally came to Canada from the UK, they became natural rivals. And in fact, HMV understood just how important this store was, that they opened their flagship Canadian location a block south. And so you can imagine what that was like, to have like this Toronto-owned music store with 5 floors next to this big British-owned music store, on 3 floors with a huge, shiny marquee with the big HMV letters across the front. And
Plenty of records to choose between those 2 stores then.
yeah. And basically, I mean, I shopped at both because, because the one didn't have the music I was looking for, or the movies I was looking for, I went to the other. And, HMV went, I think, bye-bye actually in Canada. I think they closed.
Went bye-bye here eventually as well. I think I think they got they revived as some kind of online presence, I think, but their stores disappeared a while ago.
And but I think also what that did was, because I come from really the record generation, the cassette generation. CDs didn't come out until I was a teenager. Yeah. So, so when I had my first stereo at 13, I already had like 100, 200 records that either I had already, inherited from a grandparent that had passed away, or from an uncle or aunt that gave me. I remember my aunt gave me a mint copy of the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers.
Okay.
And that was such an amazing thing to have as a teenager, to have like a first pressing of a Rolling Stones. Yeah. So like it's upstairs somewhere, like in my main sort of record rack. And so I grew up listening to records. And then I would say that FM, AM radio almost came second. Right. And then cassettes became a big thing because, here in the US, boomboxes and ghetto blasters became a big thing when I was a teenager. And that created the whole sort of obsession with making mixtapes for girls. I have to assume
I remember that. Yeah. I used to watch the chart show and just basically try and record whatever track was playing on it wasn't even a proper stereo system, with some boombox with a cassette, and try and make sure there was no audio, because they got the voiceover intro in the back. Yeah. Try and capture it without any audio and just the tracks you want. And used to get those mixtapes together and try and play that to impress girls when I was like probably early mid-teens.
Well, actually, what's funny is that, like, 'cause I have 3 kids, so I have a 19-year-old, a 15-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And we were talking about the whole cassette tape thing that's happening here, because I don't know what I know the UK, the cassette tapes have actually done fairly well the last couple of years. And in the US, tapes are starting to come back a little bit, and obviously not in the same level as vinyl or CDs. But I try to explain to my kids that we had cassette decks in our car. And so like we used to fight, like who's going to put their tape in the deck. Like we would like punch each other out in the parking lot. No, we're listening to my mixtape today in the car. And, so that's how we listen to music.
Yeah.
And, and we would share tapes. I mean, some of my friends were what we would call social deadheads. And I was never really a Grateful Dead fan. And I had a number of friends, who liked to partake a lot in the marijuana back in high school. They were Jess Spicoli before there was Jess Spicoli, and they used to follow the Grateful Dead around in the summers, and they would come back from the tours and have like 50 or 60 tapes of bootleg. They'd make like bootleg tapes of all the shows that they would go to, and and as much as I like Jerry Garcia as a sort of solo guitarist, I would sit there and listen to my friends play like 3 hours nonstop of the Grateful Dead, and then I'd want to jump. Like I couldn't.
It's a bit dark.
Yeah, and then I just didn't like it. And all the songs sounded the same to me. It was like it was one continuous song.
Right.
and then for me, so I was into heavy metal probably before I was interested in pop or new wave alternative.
Yeah.
Toronto, no matter what it thinks about itself, is still a very blue collar city. At least it was, when I grew up.
Right.
So bands like AC/DC, Rush, Metallica, Black Sabbath, that's what we sort of listened to. And then you add, other than Rush, you add some of the Canadian bands of the era, like, my God, no, actually, they weren't even Canadian bands. It was sort of the British bands and American bands like Journey and Foreigner.
Yeah.
But I mean, so for me, the first record I ever purchased was the Talking Heads, Speaking in Tongues.
Right.
And the very first time I listened to the Talking Heads on my stereo, I became a huge new wave sort of fan. And that also changed the way that I dressed, because I went from the long hair, and like I had really long hair, and I went from like the Who Maximum R&B or Who logo like jean jacket to like dressing like Robert Smith from The Cure, and underneath this hat I have a ton of hair, so it's like I could have pulled off Robert Smith's sort of spiked hair like back in the day. But it's funny though, because I was really into Pet Shop Boys, Erasure, New Order. I was really into Devo and Talking Heads and all those bands, and then I started listening. Then Guns N' Roses came out, and then we all kind of became metalheads again. And we ditched all of our so I enjoyed that transit. Oh yeah, and also U2 kind of figured into that craziness for a couple of years. We became big. I remember seeing U2 on their first or second North American tour, and one of my friends turned to me and said, "These guys aren't going to make it big." and I kind of looked at him like a year later or 2 years later when Joshua Tree came out, and I was like, yeah, I think they sold 30 million copies in the first week of this record. Yeah, they're gonna need a few more hits before they're popular.
Yeah.
Then
go on, sorry. You're saying.
So go ahead.
I was going to ask you. I was saying that. So you wanted to be a journalist from a young age. Did you always want to be a hi-fi journalist? Or
no,
was it
not ever. No, because first of all, what was a hi-fi journalist? I mean, I knew. I read hi-fi magazines as a kid. I read Stereo Review. I bought my first copy of Stereophile when I was 13 or 14. So most kids 13 or 14 wanted to sneak their dad's Playboy, which I did. But you also wanted to you bought Sports Illustrated here, and I'm sure in the UK, British kids would buy magazines about football. So here I'd buy magazines about hockey, and then all of a sudden I started reading Stereo Review, and then I bought Stereophile back then was in its journal form. It was still that very sort of small magazine. It wasn't very thick magazine. And John Atkinson, I think, had just made the move over from Hi-Fi News and Record Review over to Stereophile. Yeah. And I started buying stereo magazines like an insane person. I don't know what it was, but all of a sudden I was buying Stereophile, I was buying Hi-Fi News, I was buying a couple of Canadian magazines that existed at the time. And over the years, actually 2 or 3 years ago, I did like this big purge. I kept most of my listener magazine collection, which was probably a smart move. Unfortunately, our Dudley passed away, over a year and a half ago, and that was by far.
Those people know that was his own little offshoot, wasn't it? Listener magazine. You're supposed to be really good. I've never read one, but it was supposed to be really good.
Listener was actually, in my mind, the best of the hi-fi magazines.
Right.
Because first of all, Art Dudley was a great writer, and he was a better editor. And I think, he sort of looked at it very differently than Stereophile, the Absolute Sound, and Hi-Fi Choice, and what Hi-Fi. He looked at it very differently.
Yeah.
And I think, he created a magazine. First of all, he had the best covers ever in the history of audio magazines. The sort of like the clever play on sort of on the imagery that he used. But I mean, I don't know. I just found, I know that, and so over the years, like I collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of hi-fi magazines, and it
Yeah.
got to the point that this big IKEA unit you see behind me used to only be hi-fi magazines.
Right.
There were like probably 20 different magazines in 3 or 4 different languages, and at one point, I think I threw out 600 or 700 of them.
Wow.
You know,
Wow.
my wife was kind of happy about that.
Cleared some space.
Yeah, it was just I don't know. But then I filled it up with like 2,000 records, and she got really pissed. So it was.
So you started at Soundstage, is that right? In 98. Was that so? That was always an online publication, was it? Was that when it was really?
Yeah. Doug Schneider deserves all the credit for Soundstages. I mean, he really kind of made the whole online hi-fi magazine thing possible. Like, because if you really think about it, Stereophile and Absolute Sound and the British magazines didn't have an online presence. No. You know, and Doug recognized that there was definitely going to be a need going forward for hi-fi magazines. And I mean, and Brian, to his credit, started only a couple of years after Doug. You know, I mean, Brian started Ecoustics in 1998. Yeah. And Soundstage, I think, started in 1995. And you know, and Doug, I mean, the original crew of Soundstage writers was a very eclectic group of guys. Okay. I'm sure some of your YouTube audience will know Steve Rockland, who owns Enjoy the Music.
Okay, I don't know.
Okay, so I've been friends with Steve going back to day one at Soundstage. Steve was actually even at my wedding way back in the day. So I've been friends with Steve for a long time. But Doug Schneider, and then I'm trying to, I mean, well, guys who don't write anymore, but Doug Blackburn, Todd Warnicki. It was a very interesting group of guys. Yeah. And you know, just everyone sort of went their separate ways. And Doug obviously stayed sort of at the helm of, you know, Soundstage, and he's done a fantastic job with it. You know, I mean, I look at Soundstage now, and how flashy and, you know, and how well laid out it is, and the quality of, you know, of the way that it's done. And I think about the early articles that we all write. Our CES coverage was it was definitely interesting. But you know, but the hi-fi press though has obviously evolved. You know, I think, you know, I mean, and as you've discovered, you know, having a successful YouTube channel, you know, I mean, I've worked in media outside of hi-fi for a long time. I worked in financial media, television, print, video production for over a decade. So every industry kind of has that kind of, you know, that paradigm shift from, and when we've had it from obviously print to digital now to obviously YouTube and podcasts. And I suppose TikTok and other forms will be, you know, the next shift. But you know, it's YouTube's influence, I think, on people's purchasing sort of the way that people essentially are buying things now has completely been altered by YouTube. And you know, and I think that, you know, at some point there'll probably be an oversaturation of people on YouTube who are doing audio video channels. But one of the really the positives of doing a YouTube channel is that all you really need is a camera. You know, so like the barriers to entry are obviously very different, you know, than starting an actual print magazine, which is very expensive to do, or, you know, starting an online magazine and having a group of writers that you have to pay every month. And, you know, so it's, that aspect has really evolved, because if you look at the YouTube channels that are successful, your channel, Darko, Steve Gutenberg's Audiophiliac, New Record Day, Ron Bernay, Zeos, you know, the channels that have really sort of taken off, you know, they're generally, you know, one person operations, because like in the case of your channel, it's yourself. And,
it is,
you know,
purely me.
Yeah, right. And
sometimes, you know, I wish it wasn't. I wish there was a little bit, someone else to do a little bit, you know, a bit more with the camera work and stuff like that. But it's, I mean, I didn't even start with a camera. I started with, I mean, this is filmed on my iPad. That's it. That's all you needed.
Well, I think also, I mean, internet technology, well, Wi-Fi and wireless technology has evolved so rapidly. And then of course you look at the way that cameras have evolved inside of smartphones. So I mean, what used to be like an impossibility, because I mean, for example, like when Apple announced the iPhone 13 Pro a couple weeks ago, you know,
Yeah.
the one thing that stood out to those of us, you know, who are photographers, like people who love to do photography, you know, sort of, because I was also into photography a lot as a kid. You know, I sort of like I enjoyed going out and taking pictures of people as opposed to maybe speaking with them, because
Yeah.
as soon as I opened my mouth, you know, the stutter came out, and I didn't want the ridicule. But you know, technology has evolved so much that, you know, cameras today on a phone are really good enough, you know, to do the kind of, you know, work that people are doing on YouTube, and what people obviously are doing on Instagram, and what people are doing on TikTok.
Yeah.
And you know, I had a conversation last week with a manufacturer who basically said that TikTok is going to be the next new thing for them.
Mm.
And you know, so you know, all this sort of technology and all these platforms are evolving so rapidly. And you know, I think at the end of the day, I think magazines, I guess traditional magazines, at least the ones that started as print magazines, you know,
Yeah.
are going to have a much tougher time surviving long term, because I think that obviously print magazines are not very profitable. I mean, I don't know anybody who makes money in print anymore. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Most of these magazines didn't make money back in the day in print.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have a really, really good website that is updated constantly, and you don't have sort of your social media sort of figured out, where, you know, you're on 5 or 6 platforms, and you don't have podcasting, and you don't have YouTube and other things, it's very hard to sort of, you know, move outside of that very narrow audience, you know, that
Yeah.
exists sort of, you know, in the high end space.
Well, I find it surprising actually that, you know, I mean, if you look at stereo, I touched on this when I was talking to Brian a couple of weeks ago, and if you look at Stereophile have a YouTube channel. They had a YouTube channel before I started my channel. What Hi-Fi have a YouTube channel. I looked, I think, the other day, and I think the last video that Stereophile posted was 6 months ago on their YouTube channel. It just seems bizarre that they don't recognize or don't see. I mean, obviously you're in a position to see where the landscape changes. Do they not? What's the reason? Why don't they post stuff on it?
That's probably an answer for them, but my best guess would be that they just don't have the people internally to do it. It's sort of, because, like, you know what it is, it's like, I mean, I think when you're a traditional magazine like Stereophile, and you know, and you've been sort of around for as long as they have, you know, and then of course you made the transition to a website because you had to, because think about it, before the web, um, Stereophile was basically competing with Hi-Fi News, Hi-Fi Choice, and the Absolute Sound. I mean, they really had no other competition. Now there's probably well over 100, you know, high-end audio video websites, and then of course there's, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of YouTube channels. And you guys who are on YouTube almost exclusively have developed a bigger audience than the magazines. And I guess I mean, from Stereophile's perspective, I mean, also I want to say a part of it is, I hate to say this, I mean I'm aging myself here because I'm 51. I'm not exactly a kid. But I think no, but I think that the older generation, people who are slightly older, with maybe the exception of Steve Guttenberg, who I think, and who's like, and I think the Audiophiliac is by far one of my favorite YouTube channels. I mean, I watch all of his reviews, and you know, Steve is older than me, you know, so he's not. I think Steve's maybe even 10 years older than me. But Steve is such a warm and engaging type of person who really knows his stuff, that you know, that he's credible. But I don't know that Stereophile has anyone in its current sort of, you know, masthead who are really, really capable of doing, you know, videos. And also I think it's a consistency thing. I mean, you guys who are on YouTube, you have to consistently put out videos every week, or the audience, I hate to say it, but the audience is very fickle, and the audience will move on to someone else. And I think that, you know, that Stereophile did not groom enough younger writers, you know, to sort of, you know, kind of, you know, build on videos, you know, kind of, you know, the impact of video.
Yeah.
Does Stereophile even have a podcast?
Don't know. I don't think so. I think,
You
yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
the landscape's obviously changed quite a bit over the last 20 odd years. Have you noticed a big change from your perspective with Soundstage and with how long have you been with Acoustics?
I've only been with Ecoustics like a year and a half.
Okay. So yeah, previously with Soundstage. So have you seen the landscape change quite a bit in terms of?
Well, okay, so I would say this. Okay, so I was with Gear Patrol for a number of years before Brian,
Yeah.
and my day job prior to COVID, I'm actually a scientific copywriter. So
Okay.
like that's what I was doing because no one really makes that much of a living in audio unless they own their magazine or they have developed a YouTube business that is really very profitable. I mean, so I mean I've always had a day job.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, with three kids and one in college, being a journalist in 2021 doesn't really, pay all the bills. So
Right.
I would say Soundstage sort of has become a much flashier, but he covers a lot. I mean, Doug has, I think, 1, 2, 3, I think he has 6 sites,
Right.
and he has an Australia site and he has sort of a personal audio site, and he has like an ultra. So there's like a Soundstage sort of ultra that covers the extreme top end. And, he has a multitude of writers, who are kind of, on each one of those magazines. So he's been able to sort of develop an audience for different categories that way.
Yeah.
But Gear Patrol is different. I mean, because Gear Patrol is really a magazine designed for men 25 to 60,
Okay.
who are not really, I wouldn't say it's an audiophile crowd. I think it's a crowd of people who enjoy buying stuff.
Right.
And in the case of Gear Patrol, it's basically booze, cars, expensive clothing, hi-fi to an extent,
Yeah.
and knives and camping gear. So at the end of the day, I think the audience that I was writing for at Gear Patrol was much more mainstream.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of the high-end brands that you and I, it just drops off our tongue. Like if we listed 50 companies, we'd know the same companies and the same people. Very few of those brands would get covered by a magazine like Gear Patrol.
Yeah.
And
It's a mainstream. Yeah. It's more is it more tech based? We have T3 over here, and we had
yeah, it's more tech based, but it's also kind of what I would call product journalism.
right.
So it's sort of like, so we would write articles like, the 10 best amplifiers for, sitting around listening to music on a cold fall day in New England, kind of, fluffy like that. And
Yeah, it's not necessarily aimed at hardened audiophiles necessarily.
No, and also I noticed over time that we would keep covering the same brands over and over again.
Right.
So a lot of Macintosh, Sonus Faber, JBL, Cambridge Audio, Blue Sound, Odyssey. So I found that over time that it became essentially, unless an article was about the same brands, it didn't get a lot of sort of attention from editors.
Right.
And so I think in that regard, Gear Patrol is more of a product journalism type of magazine.
Yeah.
And I think what I have done, or what I'm trying to do with Ecoustics, is that Brian originally, Ecoustics was really an aggregator of hi-fi news and hi-fi stories.
Yeah.
Brian wasn't publishing a lot of original content. And at the time when he launched it, it was a very smart move because there really was no website that was sort of, grabbing all the hi-fi stories from across the web and putting it in one place. So you didn't have to go to 20 different magazines to find reviews. It was all on one site.
Yeah.
But then I think, Google changed their algorithm and it started to penalize sites that did not have a lot of original content. And so what I have sort of done with Brian is that I have sort of refocused the magazine on original content. Right. And while we cover the news, obviously, on a daily basis within the audio video space, Brian did not have a music section. We publish music articles daily. Brian really did not have anything on vintage audio, and vintage audio for us has been a massive success. It's actually probably the most read part of the website. So wow. I'm very proud of the fact. A lot of audio brands are not happy with the fact that our vintage audio coverage does. No, but look, retail, what companies say say to you sort of on social media, being upset that you're covering, 30-year-old products, and what they say to you behind the scenes are two different things. And so vintage is done well. We cover a lot of headphones and personal audio type products, which is obviously a massive category. And also I have sort of pushed back against the rest of the press in the audio space with a refusal to cover systems over $10,000. I kind of said to Brian when I first started, I don't want to cover the same products as Tone and Absolute Sound and Stereophile. I want to cover products that are actually more affordable, and I want to cover systems that somebody getting into hi-fi for the first time could actually afford. Because, I mean, honestly, as an audiophile, I mean, other than your interest in the product, the technology or the product themselves, how many $10,000 plus products are you buying in your lifetime?
Yeah. We have to get people into the industry. I mean, into the hobby, and this is something that was an ambition. I spoke about this with Brian a couple of weeks ago. Was an ambition of mine, was to try and, when I started the channel, I think my first series was about how to put together a hi-fi system, which was for beginners. And I really wanted to review a lot of quite accessible gear, stuff below £500. But they generally come from big organizations, and, it's very hard to get those kind of links and that kind of contact with them. I've got there now. There's a few now, only recently, with Yamaha and a couple of others, BMW now, and what was it, Sound United,
right,
and a few of those. So, but it's taken ages to try and just get through to the people you need to speak to, just to say, well, listen, are you interested in sending me something?
So my experience after 23 years in this industry, love it or hate it many times, mostly hate it, is that, the industry wants to sell bigger, more expensive boxes. And I'm very good friends with 4 or 5 PR people within the audio space. I have my closest friends in the audio industry are the PR people.
Okay.
And people that I've been friends with now for a very long time. And I would say that, we are shooting ourselves in the foot, and that's probably a nice way of putting it, as an industry, if we continue to promote this notion that you have to spend, $5,000 on this pair of speakers and $10,000 on this amplifier and $2,000 on speaker cables, because anybody who might be interested in high-end audio who's never sort of, taken that first step is going to consider any of those products anytime soon. And, and the truth is that maybe because of the fact that, I'm 51 and I'm in a totally different place now as an adult, because I have 3 children and I have totally different responsibilities than what I had when I was 25 and living by myself. I have sort of taken that step back, and actually the components that interest me the most are the inexpensive ones, because of the fact that the sound quality of entry level and sort of what I would call affordable high-end products has gotten so much better that I don't see the point in saying to some, I mean, like our music editor, Lauren Halliday, is 31. And she has a very good job, and she has an enormous music collection. So she is a music first audiophile. She told me when I first met her what her budget was for a hi-fi system, and it was pretty decent. It was actually a lot more than a lot of people who probably read our site. And I actually sort of brought her back down to earth, and I said, don't buy anything yet, because you really haven't heard a lot of the products that you're going to get exposed to writing for us. And you might discover that instead of buying that $5,000 pair of speakers that some dealer in Houston told you to buy, that there's a $1,000 pair of speakers that you like just as much, and maybe spend that extra $1,000 on a better turntable, considering you have like 900 records, in your living room. Maybe spend the extra money on the better turntable. And I think also what's happened is that vinyl's sort of comeback and revolution has brought an entirely new group of people potentially into the space. Because if you look at what's really big on Instagram, as an example, by far my favorite platform for high-end audio in terms of social media. There's an entire generation of both women and men who are under the age of 35 who are obsessed with listening to music via turntable. I mean, they are music listeners first, and they are vinyl, they're vinylholics. They're obsessed with records, and they're your potential new high-end customer. Yeah. But they're not going to be the guy, the man or the woman who walk into a store tomorrow and drop $20,000 on a high-end system. That's not how, if I'm a company, I'm going to build my customer base going forward for the next decade or 20 years. Yeah. And if you look at, like, for example, if you look at something like the Macintosh Group. So the Macintosh Group is now, it's obviously Macintosh as the main company, and Sonos Faber as the sort of the speaker. They have the distribution in North America for Rotel, and obviously they have the distribution for Sumiko and Project.
Okay.
So what they are doing, and what we're seeing here, is that they are pivoting to more affordable products outside of the traditional Macintosh customer. Yeah. Because let's be honest, Macintosh's customer base is very loyal, and people will buy and upgrade every couple of years the next new amplifier or the next new Macintosh source device. And Macintosh has had a great year and a half, even with COVID. They were closed in New York because former Governor Cuomo basically shut all the factories. So Macintosh, when they reopened, finally, they were crushed with orders. I mean, they were absolutely besieged with orders from all their distributors. But Macintosh was smart. Macintosh Group was smart. They've been promoting the living hell out of Sonos Faber's Lumina series, which is by far the most affordable speakers that they've ever done. Yeah. And they've been promoting the hell out of Rotel, and they've been promoting the hell out of Project. Yeah. And as a result, they have people who are like 30 years old buying their first high-end system, so that they'll buy a pair of Sonos Faber Lumina 1s with like a Rotel amplifier. Yeah. And they'll buy a Project turntable with a Sumiko cartridge. And and all of a sudden, here's your new customer. So, right.
The barrier to entry for Macintosh is too high, isn't it? And I think it's smart. I mean, that's what the car manufacturers did years ago. I mean, I worked in the motor industry for years. I was there at Jaguar when they launched, just after they launched the S-Type. So it was all XJ and XK customers. Yeah. And then they launched the S-Type, and that was trying to get the average age of their consumer down. It didn't work because they were so conservative with it. It was a good car, so conservative with the styling. The actual average age of their customer went up, but they learned the lesson eventually, and they brought out more accessible cars, which are more appealing to younger people. And that's how that brand evolved. And it's the same with BMW. It's the same with
Audi.
They acquired Mini for the same reason. Yeah. Mercedes developed their A-Class and all the other things to just make to once you've got people with your brand, bringing them in, and you bring the barrier to entry down, they'll stay with the brand if they're happy with it.
Well, I think the British audio manufacturers have done a much better job of bringing out products that people can afford. And I think a lot of that has influenced what I have purchased over the last 25 years. Right. My favorite British hi-fi brand is Croft Acoustics, which is a very small British man. It's one guy. Glenn Croft, and I absolutely love his products. I mean, people sort of like look at photos of his products on the internet and think it just looks like a simple. One guy wrote to me one time, like, why do you keep writing about Croft? It's rubbish. And I said, only someone who's never listened to a Glenn Croft amplifier would say that. Because, that's the other thing. Audiophiles tend to have opinions about equipment they've never heard. And the British manufacturers have just done, in my mind, a better job. I mean, Riga, Kef, Arcam, Naim. I think, the British company, Fine, Tannoy, Spender, Proac, Harbith, they've just done a much better job of making sort of components that a lot of people who are starting out, can actually buy and afford. Wharfdale is a perfect example of a British brand that very intelligently, obviously they moved their manufacturing overseas to China.
It's IAG, isn't it now? Yeah.
Yeah, right. And IAG what owns Audio Lab and Mission and Wharfdale and Quad, and
Yeah.
they make a lot of the components probably in the same factory over
Yeah.
in China, but you can actually buy them.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean,
Great value. Some of the IAG stuff, stunning value. I got it's the 6000A amplifier, the Wharfdale speakers. It's cracking. It's never been as good as it has been now, as it is now.
I think that's the other reason why I get so pissed at the industry. That when people get mad at us, like, why is $10,000 your limit for, for what you guys write about in terms of systems? It's not $10,000 components, it's $10,000 systems. It's because when you have really good products from brands like Wharfdale and Focal and ELAC and Quad and Audio Lab and Arcam and Cambridge Audio, why the hell do I need to write about $10,000 speakers that nobody is going to buy? That's the thing. I fail to see how magazines writing about like the same mega buck products is doing anything but essentially just preaching to the same older white dudes, who have kept high-end audio sort of in business for 4 decades, as opposed to appealing to a totally different audience, including women. I mean, that's a whole topic for a whole other show, but it's sort of like so Focal owns Naim, and Focal has opened up a whole series of shops now across the world called Focal Powered by Naim. And I was very, very fortunate to go be one of the first people to visit the Focal Powered by Naim in Houston, which opened in June. And they have obviously sort of decided internally to pivot in terms of how they are going to sell Focal speakers and Naim amplification and sources and streaming, now their turntable, sort of going forward.
So that's kind of like the way that Bang & Olufsen went, wouldn't they? Rather than going to dealers with Bang & Olufsen, like a little section for Bang & Olufsen, they developed that. They had their own stores, didn't they? B&O.
They did, but the Bang & Olufsen stores, the problem in the U.S. is that the Bang & Olufsen stores were in malls.
Right.
And you can say, oh, well, that's perfectly intelligent because Americans spend half their lives in shopping malls.
Right.
Problem was, 2 stores down was the Bose store. Okay. And people would walk into the Bang & Olufsen store and see, a 65-inch, plasma with the Bang & Olufsen styling for $35,000. And then they'd go to Best Buy and see the same TV made by Panasonic for $3,000 or $4,000, and then they'd walk into Bose and they'd see a pair of Bose headphones and maybe a sound bar for 1/10 the price of any of that stuff, and they'd be like, "Why the hell am I going to buy a TV that's that expensive?" So I think that also I just don't think doing it in a mall was reaching a high-end customer who was going to drop that kind of money. And I mean, Bang & Olufsen, they'll have also changed, I believe, their ownership group, and they've completely pivoted to a brand new line of products that are actually quite good. We've covered a fair number of Bang & Olufsen's product intros this year, and some of their wireless speakers actually are quite good. I mean, whoever is doing the product development now at Bang & Olufsen, it seems like they're taking the high end sort of approach a little bit more seriously. Not just the aesthetic look that made Bang & Olufsen kind of popular, but I think the Focal Powered by Naim thing is much more intriguing because Focal sells a lot of headphones now. And I think that what they've realized is that the way they're going to get younger people into a store to buy their first Focal Naim system is to sit them down in like a headphone bar, which is basically what they have in all of the stores. And you can listen to all the Focal headphones connected to the Naim Unity Atom, either the headphone edition or to just a regular Unity Atom network amplifier.
I should imagine Naim must be bringing out a range of specific headphone-based kind of amps and DACs and so on, and streaming mods. They have the Unity, but that's more still a traditional 2-channel hi-fi unit, isn't it?
Well, there's now the Unity Atom headphone edition.
Okay, not familiar.
And it's not just sort of a Unity Atom rebadged as a network amplifier with headphone amp. They actually sat down and said, I guess they looked at the way that the head-fi space has changed, with all of this, because when you look at the way that the head-fi space has changed. I mean, Brian just came from Can Jam over the weekend in Southern California. If you look at the way that the headphone industry has completely evolved with, Odyssey and Hi-Fi Man, Sennheiser, Dan Clark Audio, and the other 36 high-end, headphone companies now, Naim couldn't just put out a Unity Atom with a headphone jack. It had to actually have a dedicated headphone amplifier that actually will make the very expensive Focal headphones, sound good. Because you're not going to buy a $2,500 network amplifier with a headphone jack unless it's going to make your $1,600 headphones sound good. Yeah. And so I think Naim has.
People buying those Focal headphones. I mean, even the basic ones aren't cheap. You're not talking about Beats headphones. You're talking about some decent headphones that they know the headphone market, and that market's been very well represented on YouTube, and there's on forums sharing information. So it's a very informed audience, the headphone audience. I think that's my impression.
Oh no, it is actually in many ways. I would say it's almost as discriminating as the really sort of knowledgeable high-end crowd, people who really know what gear is good. I think what happened with the headphone space is that, number one, it appealed to a totally different audience. It was younger people. Originally, when it started, it was a predominantly Asian, sort of like a U.S., Southern California, Chinese, Vietnamese sort of group in Southern California, because Orange County has one of the largest Vietnamese and Chinese communities in the U.S. And that was where the first Can Jams took place. And now what's happened is also it's a question of also space. Like North Americans live in this fantasy that everybody around the world lives in like 4,000 square foot homes, and that everyone has 5 empty rooms in their house, to have 5 mega huge systems with 6-foot floor standing speakers and amplifiers in every room. Most of the people I know who live around the world, in the UK, in Israel, in Singapore, and Vietnam, and China, they don't have space for that. So, if you don't have room for a big system, but you're really interested in better sound quality and you have a certain budget, a pair of high-end headphones, makes a lot of sense. And then when you look at the fact that people have been stuck at home for the last 2 years, I mean, almost all of us have pivoted to working from home, as, I guess, remote employees. I mean, I was in an office. I mean, my office went remote. Yeah. People will now spend money on an expensive desktop amplifier, a dongle DAC, for their smartphone. I mean, we just look at how many Audio Quests sold of the Dragonfly. I mean, people are always curious how many Dragonflies Audio Quests have sold since its inception. It's a 6-figure number, folks. Wow. Audio Quests have made a lot of money off the Dragonfly. Kudos to Gordon Rankin on his design. But I mean, just the way it's changed. I mean, here, like these Hi-Fi Man HE400 SC that are $150 planar magnetic headphones.
Crazy.
It's crazy.
Crazy cheap for a planar magnetic, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and what's even more hilarious, or not hilarious, but more impressive, is the fact that you have an audience now of people who will spend $4,000 on a pair of headphones. They won't spend $4,000 on a pair of loudspeakers, but they will spend $4,000 on a pair of headphones. Yeah. And they will buy the appropriate amplifier, streamer, DAC, and cabling to go with it. Yeah. So there's a lesson there for the high-end audio industry, that if a 25-year-old male in his first job is willing to spend $2,000-3,000 on his headphone rig, you're doing something wrong.
There's not many people. I mean, like you say, the space is the issue. There's not many people that can get away with a rack like I have in the corner there. Seven shelves on that rack. They're all full, and my wife puts up with that. I'm sure she'd probably be quite. I mean, when I reviewed the NAD M10, with the little meters, front, and she said it's a good sounding unit. I mean, it doesn't sound as good as what I've got behind me, but it was a good sounding unit. She says, well, can't we buy something like that, and can't you get rid of that? She said, and I said, well, it doesn't quite sound as good, and also if I'm going to do this stuff and run this channel, I'm going to need a rack with all that stuff there. Right. So she puts up with the fact that it's there. She doesn't complain too much, but but most people can't get away with having all that equipment in the
No.
corner.
Not. In fact,
Really
my wife, one of the things that she hates the most about the fact that I am editor-in-chief of Acoustics is that I have 4 or 5 systems going around the house at any given time. And so it's like, I remember the first time I set up a system, I ran out of space. So I had to set up a system in the dining room. And we have like this very long, sort of very nice wood credenza. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to stick a turntable on the credenza, and I'm going to put a pair of bookshelf speakers on a pair of stands on either side, and I'm going to put a tube amplifier right in the middle. And I remember my in-laws came over for Sabbath dinner, and my mother-in-law walked into the dining room and just glared at me. She's like, what is that? And my father-in-law was like, it's obviously a stereo. And my mother-in-law is like, that has no business being in here. And I'm kind of like, okay, I'm not going to say anything as her son-in-law, but I would say the one thing that I dislike the most about being a hi-fi journalist, because I'm sure people watch all of us on YouTube or listen to us on podcasts or read our articles and think it must be a joy, it must be a dream to be a hi-fi reviewer.
Yeah.
I would push back against that and say it isn't. I would say that when you have to listen to equipment and watch equipment as a job, and you have to produce 3 or 4 articles every single day, and you don't have as much time as you would like. So instead of listening to a pair of speakers for a month, you only have 2 weeks at best, because you have a production schedule and you have to get content out. You stop listening for pleasure, which is the reason why you got into this in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's a job.
Yeah.
And
I feel like that at times.
Yeah. And I have to say that when all
from my perspective, running this, I've only been doing it for less than 2 years. I mean, 20 years on, when I'm in your doing it as long as you are, it might feel different, but even now I can tell at times it just feels like, okay, because there's a set series of test tracks that I have, which I listen for certain traits, and I don't necessarily want to listen to them again.
Right.
But I know that they're very good at revealing certain characteristics, and then you think, okay, I'm not listening for pleasure here. I'm listening for this feels like a job.
It's like, actually, I mean, it's funny. One of our readers wrote to me sort of privately when I wrote an article about some vintage gear. I wrote about Aragon, which is a brand that still exists in the US that's doing quite well again. But Aragon was very popular in the 80s and early 90s. They had a really, really great solid state amp, the Aragon 404 Mark II. And it was a particularly good amplifier to use with panel speakers like Magnapan, or electrostatic speakers like Martin Logan's. And I'm kind of more of a Martin Logan Magnapan guy. Like I use Magnapan and Martin Logan at home. And last week I had one of those moments where I was kind of like, if I stopped doing this next week, what would I own? Like if I decided to sell off all the stuff that I've accumulated for 25 plus years, and I only had one system, what would I own? And it might shock readers that I would pick something that might not be new stuff. It might be gear that's definitely a little older, things that haven't been manufactured for many years.
Yeah.
Because those give me the most joy.
Yeah.
Listening. I think that should be the message that you as a YouTube reviewer and myself as an online editor, if you don't get that emotional sort of satisfaction and joy listening to music or watching movies from on a home theater system, what are you spending your money on? It's kind of like, I mean, I know there are people who buy hi-fi just because they want to show off that they can afford to buy, like, I can afford to buy these pair of speakers and I can afford to buy this amplifier. I know plenty of people over the years who have purchased, 6-figure systems just because of the fact they can. They're not, they weren't really big music fans. But if even the most basic system, even one that costs $1,000, doesn't kind of give you a level of emotional and intellectual sort of joy, then you've gone about this all wrong. Like,
Yeah.
you don't need $10,000 speakers to enjoy listening to music. And I wish the industry would have stopped preaching that bullshit to people 20 years ago. I think it would have 10 times the number of customers that it has today if it had said to people, you need this, you need this, you need this, spend a couple $1,000s, music will sound way better than you've ever heard in your life, and then make incremental changes over the years if you feel you need to, as opposed to, if you're not using $2,000 USB cables in your system, you're a moron. I mean, the whole cable thing. I get why people sort of go crazy on audio reviewers when we talk about, oh, and if you're not using the $900 power cord on your amplifier, you're not hearing what your amplifier is capable. It's like, oh my God, stop lying to people. It's I have to tell you that the whole cable thing has really hurt over the years. I have plenty of friends who have read cable reviews in magazines and written me privately saying, like, are you guys like effing crazy? Well, like you're actually telling people you have to spend like $5,000 on a power cord? Like what? So I think the industry has hurt itself from a credibility point of view. And quite frankly, reviewers have actually sort of hurt potential customers and hurt readers by saying that unless you buy this cable, blah blah blah, your system can't sound good. I mean, come on. I mean, honestly,
I think the high-end stuff has its place. There's people out there who, I mean, I remember even years ago, What Hi-Fi used to do a segment which was about temptation, where they used to review generally more accessible gear, but they always used to have one section which was about some really high-end piece, and they were talking about that. And I think there's, if you've got that kind of money and disposable income, and you can spend that and get the best out of that system, that, fair play to you. But it shouldn't be the central message that publications, go for. And that's the issue perhaps that I have with some of the, high-end traditional print magazines, is that it's all about just really expensive gear. And as much as that has its place and there's people and you appeal to that crowd, that surely shouldn't be the central message that you're trying to deliver in this day and age.
Right. I mean, my argument, see, I don't have an issue with expensive components. I think people are going to say, oh, you just don't like expensive components because you can't afford them. I'm going to cut people off right there and say, I once spent $7,500 on a pair of loudspeakers, and that was with no industry accommodation. So I have over the years spent stupid money on products I don't even own anymore. So I would say that it's not a question of cost. I mean, obviously companies have to spend money to develop products, and it's not an inexpensive endeavor. Where I have an issue is when we tell people from a messaging point of view that you are not experiencing music to its fullest unless you spend X. That is such bullshit. It's almost like shameful that we can actually sort of push that messaging onto people and say, well, unless you buy a pair of $500 speaker cables, you can't possibly hear the music that's in your records or on your Spotify. I mean, come on. I mean, you wonder why people think that the audio industry is filled with kooks and kind of weird dudes hanging out in their parents' basement, living at home still. I mean, it's because it doesn't even sound credible. It doesn't even sound normal.
Well, those people probably haven't even heard affordable hi-fi, who push those messages out. I haven't probably even, like you say, there's a lot of people who have opinions about stuff, and it's just based on what they've been told rather than what they've actually experienced for themselves. And if you listen, I mean, I've had a perfect opportunity to listen to some accessible gear since I started this channel, and compared to what it was 10, 15 years ago, it's night and day. I mean, the higher end products aren't night and day different.
Right.
But what is different is the affordable gear is just so much better.
The most expensive stereo I ever heard was over $1 million. And I remember walking out of the demonstration thinking to myself, I could not be more unimpressed if I tried. And it was kind of like, I remember thinking to myself, and this is a brand whose equipment I think is, very well designed. It's, the engineering sort of is, top of the line. And I just sort of, I felt nothing. It was like I was like listening, and I was like listening and waiting for that moment where like my body was going to start shaking, and I was going to be like, I feel like I was lost in the moment with, the conductor and the symphony. and it never happened. And then on the opposite end, I have listened to 3 or 4 watt tube amplifiers, with like 20-year-old horn speakers and like a restored turntable, and just like sat there and listened and almost been brought to tears
Yeah.
listening to the music. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't even think this whole system would run you $3,000 or $4,000. And yet we're telling people you have to buy a $3,000 power conditioner. I think a lot of things in that regard have to change in terms of high-end audio and how it markets itself, to the mass market, because if people's attention span, unfortunately, is very short. I mean, I like to say that, even with all of the access to information and knowledge that we have in the 21st century, this is probably one of the dumbest times in human history. I mean, you only have to spend 5 minutes on Twitter, to know how many stupid people there are in the world. But it's kind of like, I guess my final message to everybody tonight would be, if you're listening to a hi-fi system and you don't feel this emotional kind of moment where like you really feel like, oh my God, I've never actually felt this way listening to my favorite music before, then it's not for you. And it has nothing to do with cost, because I've had the experience where, like I mentioned, I've listened to a very inexpensive system and I was practically brought to tears. And I've listened to a system that costs more than a mansion here on the Jersey Shore that I thought was a piece of crap.
Yeah. No, I've had similar experiences. I mean, it needs to sound the way you want it to sound, and the fundamentals are there without spending an awful lot of money. Of course, you can get better performance. I think you can get better performance as you spend more if you know what you're doing and you know how to set it up right. But fundamentally, yes, I'm with you. I think musical enjoyment and satisfaction from listening to a decent system doesn't fundamentally come down to cost. I've heard those acoustic energy AE1 speakers. I go back to those.
Right. Yes. Same with me.
Just literally, I thought, oh my God. And those moments happen very rarely. I thought, oh my God, it has limitations. If you start going through all your audiophile checklist, you can start criticizing certain aspects of its performance. But wow, did that make music? And it's £1,000 here for amplifier and speakers built in.
Right.
No association with that company. I'm not paid to say this stuff, so let me make that clear. But there's certain things that are out there that, like I say, that are quite accessible, that are just phenomenal performance these days for the money.
It's also, I guess my real final thought would be, so last night, right now I'm reviewing a outdoor portable projector, and I'm not going to mention the brand right now because it's not relevant yet, but I have an outdoor movie screen. And a lot of people wonder why I invested a couple $100 in an outdoor movie screen. It's because I enjoy watching movies outdoors, because I'm so obsessed with movies that I enjoy sitting by myself in the middle of the summer at 10 o'clock at night when everyone's asleep, watching a movie outside. And I happen to live close to the ocean, and I have the enjoyment of the onshore breeze where I live. And it's been raining here a lot in New Jersey in September. And the Jewish high holidays are most of this month for me. And last night, I set up, it's bizarre. I set up my outdoor movie projector in a room in my house where we don't really have a television or any kind of system set up. And I took this little tiny projector. It's like the size of like an enlarged beer can. And I plugged a Roku streaming box into it. And we watched Jaws.
That's a great film.
And my 8-year-old daughter had never seen it before. And when the movie was over, I turned to her and I said, "So what did you think? Are you terrified? Are you never going in the ocean again? Because we live like blocks away." And she said to me, "I looked up on YouTube and I know that sharks won't come that close to me in the water." I'm like, okay. But then she said to me, "But you know what?" She goes, "I love sitting at home here in this room watching this movie on this big screen." She's like, "It was so much fun as a family thing to do."
Yeah.
And that's actually what hi-fi should be for people. It should be that you sit even with your children and you listen to music that they like. I mean, I'm fortunate to have kids who are teenagers and one who's really young, but to listen to their music and to see the expression on their face when I listen to their music on a decent system, and they kind of look at me and they're like, So that's why you like this expensive shit. I mean, like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And
Well,
sometimes very expensive shit, and sometimes not so expensive stuff. So,
yeah.
but that's what it's. Ian, I want to just. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off? I know that you've got places to go and things to do.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm already getting those angry text messages.
Oh,
Yeah, but no. It was. I would just say to people, tune into Terrence's YouTube channel for people who are no for people because actually one of the things that just quickly why I really liked your channel from the first time I watched it is that number one, obviously you have an excellent command of the English language. So when you speak, I actually know what you're talking about. That's kind of important. But also I think you sort of enunciate the things that are important about hi-fi and why people should enjoy it in a way that's very logical and something that's very sort of easy. I find your channel very accessible. So it's sort of like I listen to you speak and I'm like, I feel exactly the same like as he does about this particular brand of equipment. And I think that's what sort of makes your channel really solid is that you don't come across as a know-it-all and you come across as someone who really enjoys listening to hi-fi. And I think you break down really well why a component is a good value or not a good value and why people might consider it. And so kudos to you for what you've done so far.
Well, thank you, Ian. Yeah, and likewise. I'm sure we'll chat again, whether it's we televise it next time we're on a video call together or not. But I'd like to invite you back whenever you feel free to come on here, and I really appreciate you coming on. And all the best with the acoustics and what's going on with you and Brian there. I'm sure you've got your hands very full with the number of stuff that's coming out. There's a huge amount of content being produced on Ecoustics, so I'd encourage people to go and check that out. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, and I appreciate the invite very much. And you're always welcome on the Acoustics podcast, which is on Spotify and Apple Music. And to the Acoustics readers, definitely check out a British audiophile on YouTube. It is definitely time well spent.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. Take care.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.